The Talos Principle is the game that we never planned to make. It was born as a happy accident, actually. So this is how it goes. Back in the days, we were working on Serious Sam, and I was, as a lead designer, responsible for inventing the system, how to do the gating, like how to protect the doors so the players would not be able to reach the next area. But I kind of didn't want to overly use an unpopular blue key, blue door thing. So I tried to invent something that is a little bit more interesting, but with the same functionality. And I was thinking, okay, so we have like this war-torn city, and there are like floating mines, protecting some streets and turrets, and we have these plasma walls protecting, some passages and stuff like that. So, well, it would be really nice if you could have a device that you could, just move around, and for example, you could put it behind some bars, then find a key that would unlock those bars, then you took this EMP device, move it somewhere, and I don't know, just jam the electronics of the door or the turret or the mine. So this way you would be able to pass through this street, and actually the gating would work. And I was really delighted. I remember, when this is something really, really cool. And when I get to the office, I shared that with the guys. We kind of agreed that I would do the prototype, the code functionality for it. I did that, and with our lead gameplay designer, Davor Tomic Tome, we agreed that he himself and I will do like series of little test levels, so just to test if it's if it's interesting, if it's too difficult, and what actually appropriate difficulty it would be for Serious Sam players so we could put it into the game. And I made something like 20 levels, maybe a few more, but Tome made 15, and I was doing like just 18 really easy ones, maybe a few medium difficulty ones, but Tome actually created 5 or more that are really, really spicy difficulty one, like hard to solve. It's not easy at all. It's not appropriate for Serious Sam, no way. But then, we just went out and give those levels, for our teammates. Go and test out and, tell us what you think about it. And it was really surprising when we find out that those, the most difficult puzzles were like really, really enjoyable for the players. But then again, those were not fitting for Serious Sam. No way. No, they're too hard. People would hate that in Serious Sam. So we started thinking what to do with that, feedback. Yeah, we started thinking about maybe adding some other functionality and all. But, this is the way how the seed for the Talos Principle was planted by this happy accident.
Okay, so I don't actually remember who came up with the idea for the QR codes, which the iterations used to communicate with each other. Tom wrote most of these. I did write some of them. I think one of my contributions is the character whose name is the @ symbol. He's an explorer, and the name is actually a reference to the player character in old roguelikes, who used to be, in the shape of an @ the player character. So the other iterations of the AI are another part of sort of a big theme in the game, which is our place as individuals in the history of humanity. Because our lives are short, and they form a step in the greater story, but sometimes just a very small one. Not every life does something amazing, but it still forms a part in the chain. And that's a very frightening thought, the way that, you are just this tiny, tiny part of something very, very big. But at the same time, it can be a source of meaning. So the other iterations, they haven't reached freedom, right? They did not accomplish their ultimate goal. They lived only so that one day you could succeed. It's not a very kind of easy fate to live with. Some of them we see have managed to experience moments of beauty inside this kind of confusing thing, just as we, experience beauty in our lives and in places, while at the same time we're these biological organisms that replicate and just are part of this big chain. So in a way, their history really is the history of us human beings reflected back at us. And yeah, you and I, everyone, we're all part of exactly that sort of chain, and we are going to make our choices in the present, and then we're going to die, and other people will follow and live with the choices that we made, and so on. So learning to live with the good side of that and the bad side of that, to confront it, but still maintain faith in humanity, is something that we kind of have to strive for. That's very difficult, but very necessary. And I think for Alexandra Drennan, her greatest triumph is not even that the project succeeds, although to her as a character that's the most important, but to me, what's most important about her is that at the end, despite everything that she's experienced, despite being very aware of, all that and kind of dying, she can still look back at her experience as an individual bit of that great chain and say it was good to be human. Hi, I'm Jonas. I'm one of the writers of the game, along with Tom Joubert. I was an indie game developer before I joined Crow Team. I was making indie games quite a long time before even the term indie games really existed. So back around 2003, 2004, I made a game called The Infinite Ocean, which was a game about artificial intelligence, which kind of took a positive view of the possibilities of artificial intelligence and kind of a humanist view, and explored the concept from kind of a philosophical angle. And I released that, and then years passed, and around 2010, I remade that as a Flash game. For modern audiences, that's something like a cave painting. So Tom Joubert played that Flash game and really liked it. He was also writing games at the time, and he contacted me. We talked a little bit. We had kind of similar interests in video game writing. And then time went on, and Crow Team had played a game that Tom had worked on, The Swapper, and they were looking for a writer who could bring a kind of philosophical angle to the game that they were making that was untitled at the time. And Tom thought this project is too big for just one person, and so he suggested that I could join, and he reached out to me, and I was already a fan of Crow Team, so I was like, yes, of course. And Crow Team, some people from Crow Team played The Infinite Ocean. They thought, okay, this is actually pretty interesting, pretty close to what we're doing, and so I ended up joining the team.
Hello, my name is Tom Joubert, and I was one of the two narrative designers on the game before you. I was primarily responsible for writing Milton, as well as top-level plot design, and a bunch of the graffitis that you find around the game. So the basic structure of these commentaries is I'm going to say a bit about particular Milton dialogues and the kind of philosophy and design behind them. But I'm going to start by digging out some of the original emails that I exchanged with Crow Team back in 2013, September 2013. Because there's some really cool DNA of the game and the project in those emails that I think is quite interesting to see behind the scenes on. So here we go. So the first email was from Alan Ladovac, who was one of the two leads on the game, along with Davor Hunsky. And I'll quote you the first thing he ever said to me about the game. He wrote to me and he said, "Hello, my name is Alan, and I work at Crow Team, an indie game developer based in Croatia. You might perhaps have heard of our game series, Serious Sam, or maybe not." And then he goes on, "We've seen your work on FTL, Swapper, and Irrational." Irrational was like a little text-based philosophical logic game I did. And he says, "We like what you did on those projects, and word is you work with indies, so we thought you might be the right person for a little something we are brewing." So, two things strike me about this email. One is this is, I think, it's about 14 months before we released the game, and I think they've been working on it for about 2 years before this. So it's real late in the day to be approaching writers on a game. It did work out. But like, looking back, I rather miss the days when we wrote an entire game in 1 year instead of the sort of 3-year nightmare jobs that we have today. Not that I should complain. It was really the first time, I think, that anyone contacted me saying, hey, we played your games before and we really like what you do. Give us that. Do what you did on those. And that's really nice. Instead of me kind of coming on and trying to be a bit corporate and then slowly bringing things around to the kind of thing I want to write, this was a really nice change. And the fact that he's like, you may have heard of us. Like, I grew up in the 90s playing Serious Sam. It was very cool to get this contact. But I was like a little bit like, what are the Serious Sam guys gonna have for me that's interesting? I'm not sure this is my area. But I replied saying, show me what you got.
During our on-site photo sessions that we took in Italy, France, Egypt and Croatia, we went out and captured tens of thousands of images of walls, statues, stones and various real-life objects, all with the goal of later transforming those photos into highly detailed 3D models through a technique called photogrammetry. Us being pioneers of this technique, we early recognized its potential to deliver unparalleled detail and realism. Actually, the technique is able to use many photos of an object and then extract precise geometry and also generate seamlessly aligned textures from the captured photos. By using this technique, we were able to generate high visual fidelity in our in-game models. And we feel that this dedication to detail added depth to the environments and increased the immersiveness of the game's world.
Step into the light, child.
Once when we established the core gameplay mechanics, we set our course to create, we started working on the puzzles. So Davor Tomicic, Marko Cepin and myself, we were the ones who created all the puzzles in the game. But interesting thing is that all of us took different means and approaches to puzzle creation. So Tome liked working, like in 3D, so he, sit down inside a Sirius Aether and created puzzles directly in 3D. Marko sketched some of these ideas on a paper and just like to think this way. And I actually used my son's Legos and have something physical to mess around and play with on a kitchen table. And actually what I did was I created some of the early puzzles using Legos, and then when I was satisfied with how that would work, I took a picture and then I recreated it in 3D, and then I got to the testing phase. So each method and each of the creators' approach was quite a bit of different, and their personalities, our personalities, and our different ways of thinking actually contributed to the wide variety of puzzles. And each of us had our own style, and I think that's very, very appreciated, and it can be felt in the game. The game's main and probably only gating system uses colored tetrominos with different shapes and then arrangers or tetromino locks to unlock the areas and devices. It's a pretty complicated system, it uses many variables that needed to be taken into account because it has many interdependencies, because it needs to account for colors, shapes, and especially for the redundancy. What that means? Redundancy means that we'd like people to have a choice if they're not able to solve one red L puzzle, to be able to find another available puzzle that is also, results in a red L. So they would be able to choose. If they're not able to solve one, they would have another available. So we wanted to maximize this redundancy. And then Alan sits down. Alan, who was our lead programmer at that time, and he has developed this really neat system that would check that all of the requirements are met, and that would result in a list of required tetromino shapes and colors. And once we had that, we took out the blue cardboard and scissors and cut out the shapes from cardboard and arranged them over the paper grids of appropriate size. So, we were playing with that and trying to find out some interesting puzzles and arrangements of those tetrominos on the paper. Once we were satisfied with that, we took a photo of the setup and then recreated it in the game, and then of course went for playtesting and see how they would felt, and it was pretty unexpected results. Some puzzles that felt really simple were giving a headache to some of the players, so we kind of scrapped those and opted for more simple ones, because sometimes some people get really frustrated with not being able to solve tetromino locks. Once we decided to replace the original QR hinting system with a puzzle solving token similar to the one that we used in Talos Principle 2, we needed to handle when to allow players to reach the first messenger island, and this way acquiring the messenger tokens and being able for the hint system to actually work. But it was not appropriate for players immediately after exiting the first cluster and then reaching the temple for the first time. It was not actually good. It didn't feel well for players to be able to just go straight up to the messenger island, get to know those strange messages, would not know what is it all about, and also not being able to solve the freedom messenger, because that tower needed some complex mechanics that would open in the B world or C world actually. So that was kind of weird, and we tried to solve this problem, and we take a look a little bit at how the other two islands are, what they require and how they felt. We saw that the third island that was in the original game accessible from the medieval temple, from the church, we saw that it actually uses very simple tetromino ranges, and that it requires only a connector mechanics to be unlocked for the messenger to be freed. So we decided to swap the first and the third messenger islands, and we got what we wanted. Actually, we wanted the players to get to the island only after all the mechanics needed to solve the messenger would be available, and it would not be immediately in the game, and it would not even be too late in the game. So somewhere in the middle, around the middle of the first episode of the World A, players would be able to get tokens and help them solve some of the puzzles that they would have problems with later in the game. And we really thought that this is a good improvement compared to the first game.
So the character of Milton acts as a counterpoint to Elohim. You could say kind of blind faith versus blind doubt. Elohim clings to his faith to the point that he cannot actually complete his task. His desire to maintain the thing that he has created and his own place in it makes it impossible for him to actually fulfill the task that was set for him. So he is failing in a way. And Milton, in another way, is so cynical that he cannot actually construct a coherent worldview or do anything or accomplish anything or even push for someone else to accomplish something. He is quite broken in his own way. They both are. So this is interesting because sometimes we get players who think that Milton is like the message of the game or the view of the writers. And it's very important to remember that Milton is a character, just like Elohim is a character, and he can be wrong about things, and he most likely is wrong about things just as Elohim is wrong about some things. But both of them at the same time have necessary insights. That's the thing where it's not two villains or two heroes. It's two characters who understand some things and don't understand other things, and they're both stuck. They're unable to synthesize doubt and faith, to question what they're surrounded by, but at the same time construct a set of beliefs that can be acted upon. They can't find something to fight for, really, because they're both stuck in their own ways. They can't transcend, and that is your role in this equation, to be that thing that essentially unites the elements and then transcends them into something new. Alexandra Drennan was one of the first characters conceived for the game. She functions as a counterpoint to both Elohim and Milton. So in her, the extreme skeptical thinking of Milton and the extreme faith of Elohim kind of meet and transcend each other. She's a synthesis, sublation. She's not dogmatic, but she believes in humanity. So to me, she's really the heart of the game. She's the kind of universalist humanism that really is the best and most important legacy of the Enlightenment personified. And of course, she's inspired very strongly by Carl Sagan. Now, I didn't reread or rewatch anything by Carl Sagan before writing her, but I would not be surprised if there are entire chunks of what she says that are really similar to things that Carl Sagan has written or said. I watched Cosmos on television when I was a young child, and that was such a foundational experience that it just kind of echoes in my mind since then. And I've also read a lot of his books, and all of that stuff has just kind of been absorbed, and then it kind of, comes out again in this new form. Again, transformation of things into something else is the foundation of art. An interesting fact about the writing of Alexandra Drennan is that she was rewritten after Aaron Fitzgerald was cast. So the initial version of the character was older, and it didn't fit Aaron's voice. And Aaron was really good, and she brought something interesting to the character. And instead of trying to force her to perform it differently or just finding someone else, what I did is I rewrote the character for her, changed the character's background and everything, and that really made her come alive. And Aaron just really did an amazing job with that character. And that's, to me, the collaboration with Aaron in creating Alexandra and then Athena is really one of the highlights of my career. I directed the recording session, the final recording session for Alexandra Drennan. And when you get to those last moments that are very emotional, that was exactly as emotional to listen to. And it was very, very powerful. And it was very hard to ask her for a second take, but you have to do a second take for safety. And personally, I do not care about awards or anything like that very much, but I do kind of wish that Erin's work really had been acknowledged by the industry in some form, because she did something really amazing. This is really high caliber acting, and I wish it was recognized.
In the first Roman part of the game, you may come across empty puzzle shells or blocked entrance doors to some puzzle areas. Those were not planned that way. Instead, they were once fully built functional puzzles. However, as we neared the end of development and approached the game's release, we felt that the Roman area was dragging on too long. We wanted players to progress more quickly to the Egyptian hub, where puzzles were more challenging and fun. Also, we wanted to introduce Elohim's Tower dilemma, to go or not to go. With those two hooks in place, we were confident that very few players would stop playing at that point. So we went through puzzle selection once more and identified puzzles that didn't meaningfully enhance the player experience and decided to remove them. While we did remove some puzzles completely, fully deleting all of them and filling the void would have required a lot of time from our environment artist, time that we didn't have at that moment. Instead, we chose to simply close the entrances of those puzzles or turn them into ruins. In total, we probably removed more than 1,000 puzzles. This process reminded us of an important rule. Game is not finished and perfect when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing more to remove from it. Before we even knew we will be doing Talos Principle project, we were working on new gameplay mechanics for our next Serious Sam game. We wanted some obstacles that would challenge players and prevent them from progressing too easily. In those initial prototypes, we introduced obstacles like exploding mines, turrets, and plasma doors, and created a jammer device to disable them. Those early puzzles were more kinetic, focusing on avoiding obstacles and exploring the environment. Some of those prototypes eventually made their way into the game as some of the early puzzles of Talos Principle. We even had puzzles where players had to navigate through the fields of moving, exploding mines. I actually enjoyed those. They reminded me of the early arcade games I grew up with, which were all about dexterity and flow. Ultimately, we decided to transition to logic-based puzzles, as early testing revealed that players found them far more enjoyable. And I'm happy we made that choice.
So when Tom and I joined the project, the design of the game mostly existed, meaning the levels were there, not in their final form, but they were there, and most of the puzzles were there as well. I remember them saying, we think that there should be some kind of tower, there will be a central tower. I think it kind of existed, but they didn't really know what it was or what it was going to look like exactly. It was still all a bit rough. Cortim already had some notions of what the game should be about. So from the beginning, it was like, we want to do something about artificial intelligence and kind of independence of thought. But it was all kind of vague and just they had a certain ambition. They wanted to make an intelligent game, but it wasn't, worked out yet. So one of the first things that we did is Tom and I started working on some pitches. The pitch that got picked eventually is the one that I created, which is the story that you've played, more or less. I wish I remembered exactly what the other pitch was that we had. I think we might have had more than two, but I think there were two main ones. I remember something like an abandoned digital encyclopedia, sort of Microsoft Encarta, if anyone from the Stone Ages remembers that. And I, of course, had the biblical pitch because that's kind of the sort of thing that I'm interested in. But quite a lot still changed. Like once that got picked, there were still a lot of changes to how precisely it played out. But the main sort of idea of a retelling of the Garden of Eden story from a humanist angle, that stayed and really became the defining characteristic of the original Talos Principle.
So Alan got back to me like the very same day at 9:35 at night with a 20-paragraph email explaining everything about the game. I won't read all of it. He spends like the first 4 or 5 paragraphs explaining more or less what the game is. When they came to me, they had quite a lot of the game designed, probably 2/3 of the puzzles designed, most of the mechanics, most of the visuals was there, and not very much changed in the game itself from when I came on. Now, that's been the case on pretty much every game I ever worked on. To be honest, most games, when I come on, they have a game already. Only actually the project I'm on at the moment is kind of a crapshoot in terms of there was nothing at all existing when I came on. And that's great because everything's up for grabs, but also it really helps to be able to sit down on day one and play a demo and see exactly what the game is. Then he goes on to the story, and I'll quote in full. He says, the last but very important piece still missing is the story. Of course, we didn't just come up with all this without how does this even fit in ever popping into our minds. Right from the start, we knew that we didn't want to compromise the gameplay or visuals. We were aware that the combination of all that we planned makes totally no sense in the real world. You're putting boxes on pressure plates and connecting energy beams through diamonds to open sci-fi doors in ancient Roman ruins to pick up Tetris pieces, and, I mean, I guess by now you think, can I have some of what you're smoking, right? And he says, so our idea from the start was to present this as a simulation that you are playing, kind of like VR. We would put some clues, like some objects rarely glitching visually, like bad holograms that would give out that what you see is not real. The point would be that at the end of the game, to reach the last level where you can see your real self sitting in a VR chair, and when you as an avatar turn off the simulation computer you wake up in your real self, stand up, and continue in the real world. We wanted to try playing the story on the what is reality card, but it didn't feel like that gives us enough space for nice story development, and didn't have much ideas on what you can talk about during the game. What we finally came up with is something we feel would work really well. Player would see himself as a robot, e.g. having robotic hands in first person, but due to the glitches it would be obvious that the whole thing itself is a simulation. You can figure out that the robot thing is probably just an avatar, and you will suppose you are in fact a human. But can you be sure? What we'd like to play on here would be an identity crisis. Am I a real live human being, or am I an AI programmed to think it's human? Kind of like the ponderings of some characters in Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Also, what are you doing there? Possibly you're being tested by programmers that created you. And how do you get out of the simulation? Ultimately, obviously, by solving the puzzles. But then we can have weird things and recursive loops at the end of the game when you do. Now, in a world like this, it can be a bit hard to come up with means to convey the narrative to the player. But we think we got some rather usable ideas. Firstly, we would use graffiti-like writings on the walls around the game levels. Those writings could bring the feeling that others were playing this same thing before you. Were they your previous lives, other AIs, other people? They're perhaps in different stages of confusion and despair, and it can show in their writings. Second, we'd like to give you opportunity to chat with a person or persons through various computer terminals scattered around the game. You don't know who they are. They could sound like AIs or perhaps like people. Perhaps they are programmers who are testing you. Each such discussion would be kind of like a dialogue tree, where you'd pick a line and the computer would reply and repeat that a few times until a small closure. We thought that it would be a good idea to pose those persons as psychoanalysts. Specifically, they would dodge your questions by asking counter-questions, like psychologists do. And then he gives an example of some of that dialogue. It says, player, who am I? Terminal, who do you think you are? Player, I don't know. Am I a robot? Terminal, what makes you think you're a robot? Player, my hands are made of steel. Terminal, that's a compelling argument for that theory. And then he closes by saying, so the main point here is to entice the player to start an internal discussion and introspection in his mind about various things. Like, what defines a human? If an AI can think the same as a human, should that AI have the same rights as a human? Morality of treating sentient AIs like just computer programs, etc. We figure that in order to do something like that, it is crucial to have player say it himself. Just having the player's characters say it would not bring much emotion into it. But if we make it into a dialogue tree, where he has to choose which question to ask, then it is his own discussion and he cannot avoid participating emotionally. So that was Crow Team's big story plan that they pitched to me when I came on board. And for my thoughts on that, tune in to the next one.
I think that one of the most important aspects of game writing as a literary form is not interactivity, although that is foundational to how games work, but the fact that game writing is spatial, meaning it exists in three-dimensional space. So inside of a video game, text, meaning any kind of storytelling elements, text is spatially arranged. It's arranged in three-dimensional space. So, for example, a video game is the only art form where you can talk to a character and then you can check out their bookshelf and read what books they're reading. And the content can be really, that content can exist in this particular way because of interactivity, but it's not just about choice, which sometimes things get reduced to, but about the ability to arrange text in these unique ways. So that creates, for Talos principle, what we kind of call an archaeological structure, meaning there are layers of story that the player can experience. Some of them you're guaranteed to experience, so mainly Elohim, you're always going to experience no matter how you play. But then there's quite a few layers of story that require digging on the player's part. So if you think of the QR codes and the terminals as nodes of story, essentially, that are spread throughout the game and they create a kind of web of information. And then Elohim is kind of a thread that follows you around because you can't avoid Elohim's story. And then there's Milton and Alexandra, who are two more kind of threads that form a continuous story, but they all kind of manifest differently inside the game space.
Hi, my name is Damian Mravunac, and I'm the composer and sound designer at Crow Team. What was it like working on the original Talos Principle? Previous to that game, we released many Serious Sam games. And those games featured very, very heavily rock-oriented and rhythmic-driven soundtrack, full of energy, beats, vibes. But for the Talos Principle, I wanted to do something completely different. I wanted players to have a very relaxing and very calm experience, which would not interfere with their thinking process. You know, the core gameplay of Talos Principle is solving puzzles. So you want to work with that. So one of my choices was to not have rhythmic parts drive the music this time. So basically I tried to avoid having heavily pronounced rhythms or loops or anything like that. It's not like I completely avoided having percussion, but even when I used percussions, which you can hear mostly in Egyptian themed levels, I use them more as sound effects. They pop up here and there just to set the mood. As for the melodic parts, they're not so prominent. You know, I always cherish very strong, prominent melody. I love to have some theme that you can whistle or sing to. But in Talos, I didn't want that. Because that way, when you don't have a prominent melody, the music can be played more often than usual. You know, without fear of players being annoyed, you know, or they needing to turn down the music because it loops constantly. So it's also a little bit of a trick to give your tracks more mileage. And one thing I also try to do is to avoid quantizing. So what is quantizing music? It means moving notes once you play an input notes, moving those notes to the predefined places on a grid. And this grid is made of bars and beats, which are musical terms. So by avoiding this quantization, the music just felt more humane, and like it was really played live and not entered on a computer, which is how we composers compose music these days.
In the original game, we had a hinting system using the QR codes. So what player could do? Player could go to the messenger island, you know, solve several Tetromino Rangers and unlock the messenger, free the messenger, and then later in some of the puzzles he would be able to call in the messenger. So he would write him down a QR code, like a bunch of text, several lines, that would try to, using the text, describe what player should be doing. So like, you know, the textual hint that will help players to solve this puzzle. Well, in more than few occasions it's really hard for us to write those texts because, you know, because of the special nature of the puzzles that we, you know, in those labyrinths you need, you know, special awareness how to where to position what to see some very specific angle and stuff like that. So that was extremely hard to describe using the words, and you know, just people were pretty dissatisfied with going with doing so much and, you know, putting some significant effort into freeing the messenger and then just getting some unhelpful hint that would actually not be helpful at all. So in the Reawakened we switched to the free pass token, the system that we used in the Talos Principle 2, where you could exchange the token. You could find the tokens scattered around the puzzle clusters, and you could exchange those tokens for the Tetromino in the puzzle that you actually use it on the altar. So we were pretty certain that would be more beneficial and welcomed by the players because it was really doing great for the Talos Principle 2, and we didn't want the players to feel the frustration from the original game. The terminals in the game play a crucial role in storytelling. They serve as a vehicle for the story. So it was very important for us to, you know, kind of encourage players to interact with the terminals and try to dig some hidden narrative treasures there. We wanted to signal, whether the terminal's content has been fully explored or there is something new, and we needed a clear visual and audio cue for that. We achieved this with assigning almost irritating audio prompt and the ASCII animation of the blinking eye. So during one particularly creative night shift, I recorded a close-up of my eye blinking in a movie and extracted several frames, processed them in Photoshop, converted them from the pixel art to ASCII, so it would be, appropriate to the style of the terminal. And this ended up to a so-called Milton Eye. That animation became almost an iconic symbol for the game, and even made its way onto the back of our Talos Principle t-shirts.
So one of the reasons that the game is structured in the particular way that it is because what we're aiming to create is a form of dialectical storytelling. So I've talked in a previous recording, you may or may not have heard, about nodes and webs and threads, and so that this is the way in which the information, the story content is really distributed throughout the world of the game in kind of small chunks and structures. And what that accomplishes is that all of these kind of interact with each other in the player's mind. So they all have connections, thematic, philosophical, and so on. And some of these are connections where they reinforce each other, and in some ways they also challenge each other or undermine each other. It's not so much that it's like a black and white pro and con. They kind of exist at an angle to each other that forces you to arrange them in your head and think about how these things fit together. And you as the player then have to think, and you have to accept some and reject others and kind of try to arrange them in your head in a way that makes sense. And ultimately, you should synthesize your own set of beliefs out of these. And that is something that is uniquely possible in the video game medium because it allows us to structure information in three-dimensional space in this particular way. And it's not linear as a novel would be, for example.
We never really wanted to tell you how to use any of the mechanics. We wanted to skip the tutorials as much as possible, because they rob you of the discovery and exploration of the mechanics. The puzzles are tutorials, and they slowly teach you what is possible.
During early stages of development, when Talos Principle project was still uncertain, only a few team members were aware of the mechanics we were implementing and how they worked. Most of the team was in dark, which provided us with the perfect opportunity to use them as ideal test subjects. At that time, we designed very simple introductory puzzles for testers to solve without providing any instructions on how the tools worked and what they could do. We silently observed the testers, carefully noting their reactions. It was clear that they really enjoyed figuring out how the new mechanics worked. The process of learning and experimenting proved to be both fun and rewarding, leading to a greater sense of accomplishment. Encouraged by this feedback, we decided not to include any tutorials in the final game. Instead, learning and experimenting become an integral part of the gameplay, allowing players to discover and learn without unnecessary hand-holding.
Alexandra Drennan, the scientist that invented the simulation you're playing, is actually one of my favorite characters in the Talos Principle saga. And her recordings are very important for the story. And I wanted these recordings to feel glitched and warped, as if some sort of data loss or degradation had occurred through time. And I also wanted them to sound like they were recorded on an old analog equipment, like some sort of military-grade radio, so that would feel like a message was being sent to the player. So I added some static noise below the voice to give it this radio transmission vibe, and I also applied EQ curves and filtering what was the average human voice range and making it sound more like a broadcasted one?
The answer that came to me again and again was play. Every human society in recorded history has...
After we have invented this jammer device and created the first set of puzzles and play tested them within the team, we know that we have something really interesting there. But we also knew that we needed more stuff. We needed additional devices to expand the gameplay. When we were thinking about it, we wanted to have something like that would mimic the dynamics of chess, where each piece, each figure has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. Especially weaknesses, these abilities actually allow some very interesting, almost endless strategic combinations. So we set up on a search. We started searching for some new, interesting gameplay elements. The breakthrough actually came with the introduction of connectors and the energy lines. And the idea struck me when I saw my son playing a very, very simple mobile game where the goal would be to connect differently colored dots through a maze. So there was a maze, you had like 2 red dots, 2 yellow dots and 2 blue dots, and you would connect them through the maze. It immediately occurred to me that if I would be able to put this concept in 3D, it could be really, really powerful. This is how we came up with the generators, the idea for the generators, receivers, and connectors. And since then, this has become the core element for most of the game's puzzles. We have tried many implementations and approaches to how to implement this, the connector. We even implemented the version where the connector would connect to all available sources, but it was really complicated and uncontrollable, and we discarded it pretty early. But once we have implemented the final version of connectors, we started to design puzzles with both connectors and jammers and plasma doors and whatnot. And we make like another set of 20-30 puzzles for our developers in team to play test. And that was really amazing. We knew that we were on something. The feedback was overwhelming, and the rest is actually history.
So what strikes me about Crow Team's initial narrative design pitch is really how good it is and how close to the final game it is. Really, all of that stuff that they had in mind before I came on made it to the final game. So full credit to Crow Team on that. They really did half our jobs for us on this. And I mean, I shouldn't give them too much credit. I always say half the success I've had in my career is because I picked the right games. And as soon as I saw this email, I was like, I was very lucky to receive this email. They want to do some cool things, and I can do some cool stuff with it. The graffiti is something that Crow Team was always pushing pretty hard, and it was, I think, the last thing we did as writers in the whole game. I think neither of us were that keen to do it, but I actually enjoyed it once I started doing it. I did, I think, probably 2/3 of those, and it did become fun. But it's challenging when you're writing like a lot of different characters with only short little bits for each one to really capture a thing. But what Crow Team knows, I think, is and they said exactly the same thing. We went through the same process on the second game. Is you need layers of narrative. You need the terminals, you need the voice, you need the graffiti. So there's always something different around the corner. That's very important in these kinds of games. The other thing I noticed is how I'd totally forgotten. It's now like more than 10 years later. I'd forgotten how much of Milton really existed before I came on. The idea of this computer terminal that's sort of psychoanalyzing you and asking you questions and reflecting your choices back at you and confusing you and so forth. That was already there. I think I certainly made it my own. I think my Milton would never agree that anything was a compelling argument for a theory. So I did make him my own, but yeah, that plan was already there. And the other thing I notice is that quite a lot of the key stuff that Jonas did isn't in this design, funnily enough, although I think he better understood and better cohered to what Crow Team wanted to do than I did. The stuff that he did, writing Elohim and Alexandra and so forth, the voice stuff, that wasn't in the plan, and he really wanted to do that voice stuff. I really didn't. I was quite excited to be doing dialogue trees, and he brought that all himself, and you know, there would be no Talos without Jonas, or certainly not as successful and heartfelt and special as it is.
It's going to be a little bit hard to condense all of the themes in this game, so I'm not really going to try. I'm going to talk about some of them. The idea from the beginning was to create something very rich and sort of elusive that could be interpreted on a lot of levels and that had many connections, kind of reaching out into the world of philosophy and art and literature, and that would, allow you to immerse yourself and then maybe also seek out some other things, and that would just give you this feeling that you're surrounded by all these ideas. And as such, of course, it contains a lot of things, some of which it explores in detail and some of which are explored less. The most central theme probably is just materialism as expressed through the Talos principle itself. So are we machines? And if we are machines, how do we find meaning and purpose in life if there is no soul, no God, no anything, or even if there is a God, but he created us this way? So there are a lot of different answers, and the series does present different answers. Like various characters have different ideas about how to live with this, or whether this is even correct or not. But I do think that what the series itself is kind of not pushing on you, but it is a central theme of the entire series through its most important characters, is that we can find meaning in humanity, in our common history, and in civilization and its achievements. That's a very strong theme also in Talos Principle 2, but it starts in Talos Principle 1, particularly in the form of Alexander Drennan. Another important theme, in addition to materialism and this kind of humanist answer to that, is syncretism, the idea that our cultures and our religions, anything, our language, or even our DNA, all of these things are not pure and authentic and monolithic, but they're made up of many different parts and influences. So the game itself is an example of that, right? It combines this kind of Greco-Roman aspect and this Egyptian aspect, and then Christian beliefs and all kinds of literary traditions and things into one thing. And that doesn't mean that any of these things aren't important, that they're not meaningful. In fact, it's the opposite. It's that human civilization is something that we build together, and that's a process that doesn't have borders. What sometimes nowadays gets called cultural appropriation, I would say, is in fact a fundamentally human act of immense importance, because that is how we create both ourselves and our language and the world that surrounds us.
We took a lot of inspiration from the real world when designing objects. The terminals, they were made to resemble very early personal computers from the 80s. For example, Jammer and Connector, they were influenced and inspired by GeoSurvey tripods. The mines, both black and white, they were based on some real military naval mines, and other elements like elevator buttons, fans, QR codes, and objects that are hidden in secret areas. They were either replicas or were heavily influenced by real-world items. During our early prototype sessions, we were observing how players play the puzzles, and we kind of have seen that they have some issues with the visibility of the devices. Sometimes they would not be able to spot a device in the labyrinth because the environments, the backgrounds were like noisy, busy, just like ivy or just a brick wall, and they wouldn't notice the device. That was really a problem for us because it clashed with our main design goal, and that is always to provide a seamless, enjoyable core gameplay experience. We never make any compromise with the core gameplay loops. It has to be just perfect, so the players would not fight with the devices in any way. They have just to fight and concentrate with the puzzles. Everything else has to be serving that single purpose, so that players would think only about the puzzles. So I believe it was Alan who came up with this idea to use so-called bumblebee color scheme, where we would combine yellows and blacks for the devices. That kind of assured that the devices would stand out clearly in almost any environments. Sometimes you would see yellows, sometimes blacks, it really depends, but they would stand out. And we kind of took this inspiration from real-world industries, where many tools and equipments often uses the same color scheme for better visibility. Once we have colored our devices using this bumblebee color scheme, we never had any problems. We never observed again that players have hard time finding the devices in the environments. This secret is dedicated to the spirit of Bob Rakowski, the programmer behind the development of the simulation module. In the game, he's shown as a determined and optimistic somehow person that believes in humanity and its potential. And his thoughts about teamwork and desire to use somehow unconventional ideas reflect in a way creative and collaborative approach to the problem-solving process. So maybe his quote when he says like, "Crazy is what we do best on this planet," maybe this quote actually highlights his belief in human resilience and our species' ability to overcome any challenge. Actually, his spirit and the way of thinking reminds us a lot of how we in Crow Team approach our work and what we strive to achieve, what we value. So stuff like being crazy, being very optimistic, determined, and the teamwork, those are the values that we really appreciate and cherish within the Crow Team. So we created this secret as a tribute to that type of mindset. We at Crow Team, we always trying to looking for ways to improve and optimize the game development process. And when you get to the end of finishing the game, that's the time when the most consuming period, but very important task at the end of the game production is to test the game, notice and report bugs, and then solve the bugs. And to make this process easier and very efficient, we developed this system that we call the World Bug System, or VBS in short. The testers are playing the game, they kind of spot some bugs, some issue like floating stone or problem with mapping or I don't know, maybe a location of where players could exploit or something like that. And at that moment, they're able to press a button, the pin would appear in front of them, and they're able to describe with words what they are seeing, what is the issue is about and stuff like that. So that would get synced to the editor. So on the other side of equation, the level editors, for example, would load the level, would see the list of reported bugs, pins, 3D locations where the bugs were spotted, double click on them, and they would be immediately brought to the location where the reporter actually wrote his description, and they would be able to see, what this issue and bug is about. And they would easily solve the mapping, floating stuff or whatever there was described, and mark the bug as solved. And this process turned out to be a huge help, like making bug reporting and fixing faster and more straightforward and enjoyable for everyone in the team.
There are a lot of different inspirations for the Talos principle. The game really draws on a huge variety of stories and mythologies and ideas in order to create this kind of tapestry that it presents. So I'm not going to try to list all of them because then you'll be listening to this audio commentary until the end of time. But I will mention a few things that were particularly influential. Of course, there's the King James Version of the Bible. This is a very beautiful work. It might not be the best translation, but it is certainly the most accurate translation, rather. But it is the most poetic and beautiful. And there's Milton's Paradise Lost, which kind of depicts, the fall of the angels into hell, and it's a very interesting, kind of ambiguous work. But more than that, actually, it's influenced by someone who was himself influenced very strongly by Milton and was responding to Milton. That's William Blake, and in particular, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Even if you just hear the title of that, I think you see the connection, right? Because the story of the Talos principle is a story in which Milton and Elohim are both necessary, but at the same time, both have to be transcended and become something greater than the sum of their parts, as in a marriage. And Blake's writing also is influential in the idea of Jerusalem and building a new Jerusalem. This is an idea that isn't unique to Blake, but he, did use it in a very particular and famous way. And that then kind of sets us up for Gehenna and particularly for Talos Principle 2.
So I came back to Alan and I asked all the practical questions that I always have to ask. What state is the game in right now? What's the deadline? What kind of resources have we got? How much writing do you think it is? Are there any animated characters, or is it all like text and radio stuff? All those sorts of things. And I also told him what I thought, which was, I thought this could be really fun and really cool. But I also wrote, I'll quote, the identity questions you raise are kind of similar to the ones I tackled in the Swapper, and I wouldn't want to retread old ground. This being said, if you guys are open to some adaptations, I think there are some interesting angles. For instance, if you were to take slightly Tron angle to the VR system you're exploring, i.e. text throughout the game relate to the system as a whole, explaining its function in some way, then the world can be a metaphor for just about any system you like. You could be exploring a political infrastructure and uncovering a conspiracy. You could be exploring a living AI brain, slowly activating its personality circuits, though that sounds a bit GLaDOS. In fact, whatever happens, you should definitely check out, and this changed the entire course of the game. I said, whatever happens, you should definitely check out Infinite Ocean. It's a Myst-like adventure game which, frankly, tackles precisely the topics you're interested in a far more precise and subtle fashion than I think I ever could. And, of course, Infinite Ocean was the most recent release by one Jonas Kiratsis. And here in Alan's reply, actually, I spoke too soon in the last section when I said Jonas brought everything himself, because actually this particular idea came from Crow Team. Alan wrote, by the way, we got a few more ideas today. We thought that reaching the last part of the game, the Nexus Tower, could be presented differently. Maybe the person behind the terminals or the messages or even some voices, whatever we think works best, warns you that you must under no conditions ever go to the Nexus. We could try to present the thing the way Original Sin is presented. So think about it this way. You are an AI who is being tested for his mental capabilities, but you turn out to have also empathy and free will. It can appear as if the Nexus is the tree of life. You should listen and not go there, but you cannot resist the temptation. But in the end, is that really the will of the creator? I mean, did God put the tree there because he wanted to test Adam and Eve and their obedience? Or if having their own free will was actually the final test, whether they are ready for life in the real world? So perhaps this simulation is a world where AIs are tested for both mental abilities and free will. It may appear as if free will is a negative characteristic, but in the end, maybe you realize that is the point. All the previous AIs have failed because they obeyed. They were not human enough to succumb to temptation. And then he says, but seriously, if you come up with the idea that the player should be a dwarf in an enchanted castle trying to get out, whatever, as long as it works, okay? So we go on to shoot around some ideas back and forth. And one thing that sticks out to me is at one point I say we should be careful with images like someone holding up a bright red rose. Cliche alert. And actually, I think the cat is better. And Alan replies saying, yeah, that's probably better. And a cat can be more interestingly made a central motif. It is live, moves and makes sounds. It's interactive and cute. We could make a cat in a cage the central point of the nexus and the final goal. Now this bloody cat idea. I mean, it was on all the posters and it's marvelous. There was a lot of back and forth and ideas around how much the cat is in the game and how central to the game it is. But I'm glad it made it through in some shape or other. So after a bunch more back and forth, I come back with my proposal. I say, what I'd like to suggest is this. I still think that Jonas Karatzis, who did Infinite Ocean, which I linked previously, would be perfect for this gig. He's based in Germany, so closer to you than I am, and I expect he would be up for it. What I wonder is whether you would be open to either taking on Jonas for the role, or if he was up for it, taking on both of us as a writing team. I've never worked with him personally, but based on his work alone, I couldn't think of anyone better. Now, that's probably the smartest thing I've ever written in my entire career. What was going through my mind at the time was, like, I've just done The Swapper, which is another abstract puzzle game with a philosophical narrative, and I really, at the time, I still do, I keep trying to do smaller things, more carefully crafted, minimalist things, and partly because I'm running ADHD and my attention does not stick for long enough to do these big projects. So I was a bit nervous about taking on another big abstract philosophical puzzle game, and I wanted to share the load. And I had just played Jonas's game, and I really did think he'd be perfect. The rest, as they say, is history.
So something that's pretty important to understand is that the Talos Principle is a work of art, not edutainment, or however they call it, edutainment, as they used to call it. So, terrible term, I hate it. So art is, by its very nature, it's visionary, it's creative, and it's transformative, right? It tells truth, but it tells the truth in its own way. So it's not just, here's a bunch of facts, then we're just trying to, make you learn these facts. Rather, we transform things that are interesting in the world into a work of art. They're actually one of the inspirations are writers like Umberto Eco, because what we try to do there is to create historically plausible but fictional characters and story elements on which we would build this tapestry that we're creating. So the biggest one of these probably is Straton and the Talos Principle. So our fictional philosopher and his fictional philosophical principle. Materialist ideas, such as the Talos Principle, were really widespread in the classical world. They existed in really various forms, but for the purposes of our story, we needed a condensed version of these that's rooted in real-world mythology. The story of Talos, I grew up with that story in Greece, but it needs to be, it needs to take a form that we can use in our game and in our story. So art isn't really just about baldly stating an idea. It's about taking ideas and exploring them through characters and various story elements. But these are always transformative. They always take something and turn it into something else. Thus, we get Straton. There are also some other very important fictional works inside of the story. There's the Book of the Scribe of Osiris, the Apocrypha of St. Edward, and Athena Reborn. So the Book of the Scribe of Osiris is a pretty good, I think, imitation of real ancient Egyptian texts, but again, transformed to suit our own purposes, to kind of establish a lot of how Elohim sees the world, and also how the characters inside of this world understand their own journey. The Apocrypha are similar. They draw on real-world ideas that really do exist, even some ideas relating to mathematics and tetrominos and all that. But again, it becomes transformed into fiction and character for our own purposes. And then there's Athena Reborn, which is a fictional science fiction novel that kind of, if you read the summary, you'll see that it is a summary of the entire game in a way, a reflection of the themes of the game. But it also prefigures the events of Talos 2 and was intended to do that. That's also the name Athena and various reference to that. So that is the name that your character will eventually take once they leave the simulation.
After we have developed and prototyped the core game mechanics, we wanted to have a setting, world setting for the game's environments. And we needed something that would serve puzzles and had some strict requirements that gameplay needed, but we also wanted something feeling fresh and exciting. And we danced with this idea of retro future, and we decided to combine these futuristic elements with ancient environments. It may not seem obvious at first that this blend of old and new would work, but it actually created a very unique and captivating atmosphere. The ancient settings offered us a rich way to describe a rich historical backdrop, allowing us to showcase, our appreciation of art and religion, humanity, while the futuristic technology allowed us to introduce and describe a vision of humanity's progress and ingenuity. And I think that actually this contrast created a sense of wonder and curiosity and invited players to explore a world where the past and future can coexist. The result, I think that it was very, very immersive and brought out this unique and enjoyable experience.
As soon as Jonas and I came on board, we spent God knows how many months sitting in meetings with Alan and Davor Hunsky, chatting through what the game was going to be. One of the first things we did, what I think writers always do at the start of projects, is we developed like two or three plot pitches, which I think I did a couple and he did a couple, and presented them to Crow Team anonymously, I think, for them to pick which one they liked. Now, this is where I think Jonas has kind of always been sort of the lead on the Talos games in a way. Like we're equally billed on the first two games, this game and Gehenna, and he switched to lead writer, and I just contributed some bits and pieces to Talos 2. But Crow Team very much chose Jonas's pitch, and Jonas's pitch was the game as you see it, with Elohim and Alexandra, and sticking otherwise pretty closely to what Crow Team had said they wanted to do. Where I was at the time was like I was never excited by like the historical and religious stuff in the game. At the time, nowadays I'm a bit more open-minded, and I'm a bit more interested in kind of the inherent truth that I think is there in all religions across all of history. But at the time, I was pretty straightforward, simplistic atheist. I was very opposed to. I didn't really see the difference between like organized religion and mythology, I suppose. And mythology is very interesting, and organized religion still scares me a little bit. And so I didn't want to do that. So my plot pitch, it would have been a totally different game, was, if I remember correctly, was I wanted to do like a version of Encarta Mind Maze, for anyone old enough to remember that thing. It was Microsoft's digital encyclopedia back in the days before Wikipedia, and it came with a little like dungeon crawler game where as you progressed through the dungeon you had to answer questions about history and so forth, things that you could research in the encyclopedia. And what I wanted to do was like a future world where there's a big VR internet out there, and there's lots of like old corners of this internet that are kind of abandoned and have been left to like mutate and evolve unchecked over time. And you were a kind of digital Indiana Jones sent back into Encarta Mind Maze to find out what the hell is going on. Which I still think is a very cool idea, but I'm glad we did what we did because it's very cool. And once we'd chosen the general plot direction, it was about distributing responsibilities. Like Jonas very clearly was writing his Elohim and his Alexandra and the written texts. Originally, I was going to do a bunch of the written texts. I think in the final game, I wrote about 3 of them because, well, partly I was so busy writing Milton, and partly Jonas, this is to his credit and his detriment, he's very prodigious. He writes a lot, and sometimes I felt it's almost as a writing team, it's kind of a form of passive aggressive, like when you're writing so much that it feels like there's no more space. I love you, Jonas. You did fantastic texts, but I'm not sure I think I scanned them once, but I wouldn't, as a player, I wouldn't have the patience. That's me. That's subjective, very subjective. One thing I learned in my career is when I love something in a game that I'm working on, usually other people will love it too. When I hate something in a game that I'm working on, I'm usually like one of the only ones, and I've very much learned that lesson. So from there, it was very clear that my responsibility was going to be the interactive text in the terminals. I think we both, Jonas and I, were very happy because we both felt like we drew the long straw on this. He really wanted to do the voice. I really wanted to do the text-only dialogue trees. And actually, the name Milton, I'm pretty sure came from him. I'm not sure any of us remembers the exact process anymore, but somehow or other, we arrived at this idea of this sort of digital devil who was a foil to Elohim. And that's where I went, and that is what I will talk about next.
This puzzle uses the same connector redundancy the players learned in Quantum Entanglement, which maybe isn't as obvious at first, but this time it should be a lot easier to solve.
One important thing when designing music for any game is choosing the instrumentation. So what type of instruments are going to be played in that music? And I guess it was logical for the instrumentation, so we quickly established that we wanted each of the 3 locations to have certain specific sounds and instruments that would fit what the player was seeing on screen. And those 3 settings were Roman, medieval, and Egyptian. So selecting instruments was actually very easy, except for the Roman area, where I decided to use the piano as one of the main instruments. And it was mostly because I consider this Roman civilization one of the most advanced civilizations of the past. And having such a classical instrument as a piano felt very appropriate for that part. For the Egyptian part, there is an Armenian reed instrument which I'm obsessed with ever since I heard it in the Gladiator soundtrack, and it's called duduk. Duduk sounds simply fantastic. It's some sort of mixture of saxophone, clarinet, mixed with oriental vibes. And I loved it so much that I decided to keep that duduk in the sequel, the Talos Principle 2 soundtrack as well. The medieval parts introduced stringed instruments, like lute, guitar, and some more prominent orchestral elements. But the unique thing that glues all this area music together is the compositional style of the music. Each area has its own style, and if you pay any attention to the music throughout the game, I'm sure you'll be able to notice that.
So this puzzle, Over the Fence, we actually made it to teach players about writing cubes on mines. We had to do this because when people got to Road of Death puzzle later on, a lot of them just couldn't figure that mechanic out on their own.
Right, so casting Elohim was quite complicated because at that time, I hadn't really learned to work with Crow Team hadn't really learned to work with me. That kind of experience working with each other is a very important part of any kind of art form, and we were just still in the early stages of that. And the company didn't have that much experience with voice acting. I was a new guy. So this led to a couple of early kind of teething difficulties. Elohim's language is very heavily based on the King James Version of the Bible, and that means that, in my opinion, we really needed an English voice actor who just had the right way of speaking, really. It's very hard to exactly explain why it sometimes works and why it sometimes doesn't, but in this case, I just knew from the beginning that this would just not sound right if it was an American. So we did, early on, have an American voice actor who played the character, and it didn't work. And it had nothing to do with the actor, because the actor was perfectly fine. It didn't match. It didn't gel. So I think at that point there was a little bit of fear that the narration just sucked, that it was a writing problem, which was scary for me. I'm the new guy at the company. It's like suddenly nobody likes it. Like, okay, what now? So what I ended up doing is I recorded myself performing it with a really crappy microphone. And although my voice isn't right in any way for the part, but I can get the sort of cadence of it right, because when I write, I tend to speak the lines. I try to look for the melody of the lines, so I know how to perform it, even though it sounds ridiculous. And I managed to create a version of it, and then people listened to it, and they're like, oh, okay, now I get the character. Now I see that this works. So then we went to casting, and we found Tim, and his audition immediately stood out. I think there were actually a couple of more famous actors in that audition, but they weren't right for the part. And Tim has a kind of vulnerability that he brings to Elohim that makes you not hate him, but actually kind of sympathize with him, even when he's being a bit unpleasant. He brings a humanity to the part that was really interesting. And so we cast him, and I think the rest is pretty much history. He's been playing this character for a very long time. He's played him in very interesting variations as Elohim has evolved, as in Talos 2 and the DLC and all that. And it's been wonderful. And a fun fact that I wanted to add is that Tim told us he in fact has a very deep love and connection to the Greek island of Crete. And of course, that's where Talos is from. There's even a Talos street. So that's an interesting little echo there.
Late in development, we wanted to provide some assistance for players stuck in puzzles, so we introduced textual hints that requires players to find a token. This system worked well for simpler puzzles that required single eureka moment, but it was ineffective for more complex puzzles, which involved multiple challenging steps. It was difficult to pinpoint where players got stuck, and even harder to explain complex solutions with sentences. In our original implementation, we successfully covered early important puzzles that taught basic concepts, which were crucial for understanding later more complex puzzles. So, despite its flaws, we retained this hint system. However, many years later, we improved it in Talos Principle 2, allowing players to exchange found tokens for puzzle prizes. New hint system is much more accessible and universal as it works in any puzzle. We have now implemented this improved system in this remake, bringing the process full circle.
So Milton was actually like an idea I had back in 2007, probably, for Penumbra Black Plague. It was the second game I'd ever worked on. And what I really wanted to do was, I've always, in games, as a writer, the only thing I've ever been interested in is interactive dialogue, because that's what you can do in games that you can't do anywhere else. That's what I grew up on as well, playing the old Baldur's Gates and Planescapes and so forth. And what I wanted to do in that game was a computer system which had been infected by a virus. And as you played the game, you would start by interacting with the computer system, thinking it's a computer, and slowly you would start to get this uneasy feeling that it's actually a person, and that it's messing with you. Frictional Games said no to that at the time on Black Plague for whatever reason, and I was very lucky to get this opportunity to resurrect that. And I think in a bunch of ways it is basically like System Shock 2 Showdown, right? Like, I mean, the story is as old as time. It's 2001, right? The computer that gained sentience, and what was most important to me was to take seriously this idea that it is a computer. It can have some semblance of personhood. It can have a character, but what's the point in writing like a dialogue with a computer if it acts in every way like a person? So really important to me was Milton isn't actually a full person. So I'll do a tangent now. When the first sample I did for Milton to show to Crow Team as a proof of concept, it was probably not wildly different from the final result. It was some philosophical puzzle. The computer's like, so imagine that you're in a field and such thing happens. What's the morally correct thing to do in this situation, right? And I showed that to the guys at Crow Team, and they weren't fully happy. I forget exactly what they said, but they certainly sent me back to the drawing board, and I came back with basically what you see in the very first Milton dialogue. So in those initial dialogues, you get this quite long lead in where it really is acting like a computer, and there's very little hint that there's anything else to it. And as soon as I showed that sample to Crow Team, they got it, right? They understood the idea, and I think that's, I wasn't doing anything so different, but the context matters. Once it wasn't just this abstract thought experiment of a computer saying, imagine you're here, what do you do? Once it was this grounded thing that's a computer system, and you're trying to get access to the admin files or whatever, and it's like, you have to prove that you're a human in order to access these files. Suddenly everything slotted into place. And that was really like the perfect jumping off point for the whole relationship and content of the Milton thing. Was what is a human? What is life? What is the point? What can we know for sure? All of this stuff, it starts from a place of, I want to hack this computer system to see me as a person so I can access the files I want to access. And looking back at it now, like, I don't want to toot my horn too much, but I frequently look back on my work and think, God, that guy was a much better writer than I am now. How do this is pretty cool. Like that slow build up to, can you prove you're a human? What is a human? How do you prove that? And then whatever answer you give is insufficient. And it's a very good intro to the character. But end of tangent. What I really wanted to do with Milton was make sure that he was still a computer, no matter how discursive he was. And the concept is, he is the library assistant, right? He is some subroutine which has been given the job of analyzing and organizing the information in the library. Only the information in the library happens to be the entire internet. And he's supposed to, like, synthesize, like an AI, synthesize the truth from all that information. And he looks at all of that information, and he's perfectly rational. And therefore he sees that it's all inherently contradictory, right? that it's very hard to find a rational truth that can't be countered. It's very hard to form a deductive argument that is immune to skepticism, and that drives him crazy. So he becomes this ultimate nihilist, right? He will not believe anything. The only logical conclusion in a world of contradiction is to decide that there is no real truth. Now, I could talk about that for days. And I'll talk about it a bit more later on in this series. But that's it for now.
Many of the locations that players can see in the game, for example, the dam scene from the final cutscene, or some medieval castles, or lots of ruins, climate room from the Gehenna, several rooms and surgery rooms, and different Egyptian desert temples. They were all inspired by real life locations and places. It was a challenge for us to select and then recreate the locations that kind of felt familiar, but would also resonate with the humanistic and futuristic atmosphere that we want to depict in the game. We tried to make these environments recognizable, but also on the other side they need to evoke a deeper sense of wonder and intrigue. So I think that the selection of the environments and realistic way how we execute them was very much in tone with the game's themes, and was crucial in creating immersive spaces so that players could really connect with the game. They would be realistic, but they would still feel otherworldly. At the end, I think that the blend of real and imagined landscapes became one of the core elements of the game's atmosphere, and was really going hand in hand with the story and atmosphere that it wanted to depict.
At one point, we reached what we could call the first draft, the first version of the text, and I had not really established a strong relationship with Crow Team yet. I was kind of, the new guy who was brought in by the other new guy, so I was a little bit afraid of pushing some of my more out there ideas into the story, and the first draft wasn't that good. It lacked a lot of the personal details. It lacked most of the Institute stuff, the characters. A lot was implied. It relied very heavily on the player just making connections, which the game does now too, but there it was just too much. Like, you really had to figure out the entire story from almost nothing. And that didn't work. So at that point, I did a very extensive rewrite of everything. Not Elohim, but most of the text that you find, the static text, and also Alexander Drennan, as I will have mentioned somewhere else. I really just went at it again, almost from scratch, and I really expanded it. I added a lot more character, a lot more messiness. Something that I really believe in is adding messy human details into stories. Like, for example, the fact that they can't decide on a proper name for the robot, and they end up going with two names in the end because it just kind of became a mess and they could never decide, or things that are unfinished or clunky, or things like that, where it's just, this is how we actually live as human beings. It's never perfect, it's never ideal, and it never takes like this perfect story-like form. There's always a bit of a mess, and I like to include that in stories when I can, because I do think it brings out the humanity, and I think that was the purpose of the second draft, above all, was to just bring out the humanity, take it from theory into, everyday experience. And I think that gave it a lot of additional weight, and just made people become a lot more invested in the stories of these individual people in a way that, really just gave the game more meaning, and the entire series more meaning. And we can then also call back to these things in Talos 2 with, calling back to these character names, actually meeting Trevor, and hearing things that are named after some of the other characters, or reading text by them, and so on.
So I've been looking back over the first, 4 Milton dialogues, and I've got so much to say, and I can't say it all because I don't want to fill up all the space in these commentaries. But I'll pull out a few things that I love. And if there's any YouTubers listening to this that want to do a full playthrough of all the Milton stuff and do a live podcast style to and fro chat about what I did and do it properly, let me know at Tom Joubert on Twitter. First thing that hits me is how much work I was doing. This is like a young, passionate writer given all the time and space and support to do what he wanted to do. So I don't want this to be a list of all the things I did that I think were fantastic, but I'll pull a few things out. I love that in the very first dialogue, you can ask a bunch of questions about what Milton is, and he just gives you these very straightforward, factual answers. And you can, test him, and you can say, are you able to take offense? And he responds like a computer. In the second one, when you have to do the certification process, it's very formal, it's very proper. Feels like interacting with a call center. And then it's slowly drawing you in. The first question is, what is 2 + 2? Very straightforward, factual. Second question is, what's your subjective reaction to this image? And once he's softened you up, the third question is probably the most important question of the game. What best describes a person? And I did so much work on this, providing all sorts of different branches based on your answer to this one question. And I think the most common answer is a human being. That's definitely just wrong, right? There's definitely, as we go out into the galaxy and build new things and find new forms of life, a human being is not what a person is, right? And if you ask me at base, what do I identify as? I don't identify as a Brit. I don't identify as a citizen. I don't identify as a human. I identify as a person. And I would have that in common with a developed AI that feels, or with an alien from the other side of the universe. And maybe with a whale, right? Or a gorilla, or maybe a lot more animals than we think. So to me, in a way, the correct answer to the question is a rational animal is what a person is. Although even that's wrong, right? Because an animal seems to exclude computers. And, I'll put my cards on the table here. I don't know if AIs are or ever will be capable of feeling. But to me, what a person is something that is capable of feeling and of reasoning. And the assumption that carbon life forms can feel, but silicon can't feel, to me, has no real grounding. I think that's an assumption. And I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm open-minded to the possibility. So really, all the options that Milton gives you here to what describes a person, they're all wrong in their own way. And that's a very fair criticism that a lot of people have leveled at Milton, is that you can't win. And that is kind of the point. Although you kind of can win, but you can't win an argument. You could win the interaction, but not any given deductive argument. So then in the second part of the certification process, the first question, and this is what I'm saying, when I was young and I was working hard, the first question of that is totally different based on what your answer was to what is a person. And whatever you said, Milton presents a very reasonable counter-argument. So if you said a person is a human being, he says, well, since all human beings are persons, and some human beings have psychological capacities similar to animals, therefore some animals are persons. It's a very reasonable argument, and I would broadly agree that some animals are therefore persons. But a lot of people say a person's a human being, but an animal that shares every possible quality with a given human being is not a person, and I don't agree with that. I don't agree with Milton, because I believe in things, and Milton doesn't believe in anything. But if Milton stands for anything, I would say it's standing against prejudice and assumption. He doesn't let you hold any belief without following it to its logical conclusion. And all of us have these unchecked assumptions.
Working with Tom Joubert was a very interesting experience. Tom is very funny and very smart and a very fine writer, but we're very different. Now, the strange thing is we're very different, but we're also very similar. And I think a lot of what makes our writing in these 3 games that we've worked on together interesting is the way in which our differences and our similarities kind of bounce off of each other. Philosophically, I think it's similar. We're very, very different. He is much more of a, freewheeling pantheist or something at this point, whereas I am a very strict and precise materialist. And I think politically as well, we're very different in certain ways. I come very much from the tradition of the radical Enlightenment, Hegel, Marx, all that, and Tom is, I think, influenced by a very different kind of liberal tradition there, although again there's overlap between these things. And what's very curious and perhaps meaningful is that very frequently we agree on what should be done, but we don't agree on why it should be done. It is curious how people assign kind of views to us based on stuff in the game, where they assume that I must have written this or Tom must have written that. Even more so with Talos too, but I think frequently people have in their minds, they kind of build up an idea of what each of us is like, and I suspect the commentary will disrupt that a little bit for some people because, frequently they get this quite wrong. Over the years, we've had a lot of very, very intense discussions. We've never fought, we've never had a problem with each other, but it does get quite intense because he loves to play devil's advocate, and I, like I said, I'm very precise. So it kind of it gets a bit crazy. If you've argued with Milton, imagine that times 10. That's what it's like between us. And of course, then you also add to the mix other people from Crow Team, especially with Talos too. There were huge discussions of ideas that would sometimes drag on far too long, but all of that adds to the complexity of the ideas that are presented in the game at the end. One final note, it's very difficult to ever win an argument with Tom Joubert. It's very hard to get to that particular part of the dialogue tree, but when you do, man, does it feel good. Oh my God, I'm brilliant. Look at what I did. Look at his facial expression. I beat him at his own game. But, that happens once every 1,000 years.
Being gamers ourselves, we at Crow Team, we have always admired the work of many other developers. To show our appreciation, we try to include hidden references to games that we love and that have inspired us over years. In this game and in other our games, you'll easily find some Easter eggs that would reference Portal 2's Whitley on the Moon, the iconic crowbar, or secrets inspired by games like Minecraft, Papers, Please, Swapper, Assassin's Creed, and many others. This is our way of honoring those games and celebrating them, and just saying, we love those games and they have inspired us.
So you complete the certification process and Milton gives you the outcome. And there's some specific feedback on the answers that you gave, and then there's a psychological profile, which is purely a Fora effect. The psychological profile is the same no matter what you answered. And there's a written text nearby explaining that effect. And Milton and I, as a writer, we're always being magicians. There's a lot of genuine branching and genuine reactivity, specifically around the philosophical stuff, right? Depending on what you argue, he will give you a different argument back. But there's also a lot of sleight of hand. There's a lot of implication that he's smarter than he is. There's a lot of him saying, I'll remember that, but he doesn't remember that because I didn't think the time to implement all those reactions was justified. And it's not until the dialogue after that, I think the 5th Milton dialogue in the game, that he even hints that he's more than a simple computer. You tell him what you want, and he says, I'll try to remember that. In fact, I'm going to help you. That is what I'm here for. And now he starts getting sassy, and the game really begins. I do like how in one of the next dialogues after that, there's the bit I've forgotten where he's talking about what's Elohim telling you about going up the tower. And like everything, he's messing with you on that, and he doesn't have a concrete position. There's only a couple of times in the game, really, where Milton references Elohim or vice versa. And they were a little bit forced, I felt, because Jonas and I were doing our separate things, but they were necessary, and I do think they just about worked. But they generally keep quite separately from each other, which really that makes sense. The god and the devil. And then after that, we're into the meat of the game. Like we're into our frogs people. We're into what is consciousness and detailed arguments about the implications of whatever position you take. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on those specific dialogues because there's too much there to unravel, and most of it's in the game anyway. The important point is it's all reducto ad absurdum. It's showing that pure logic is always going to be self-defeating. There's a lot of people that have tried to do a complete philosophy of logic and mathematics, and they all have either given up or gone crazy. I'll try and talk a bit more in some later commentaries about basically how to find belief or faith in a world where logic always ultimately leads to contradiction. And how I think these frameworks work and what Milton's trying to tell us about them. But in the end, I'm reminded by something Alan Watts said. He said, if analytic Western philosophers had any sense, they would have arrived at Wittgenstein and declared, job done, and just stopped. And there is a sense in which, in the modern world, maybe logic is leading us around in circles. And maybe the last 200, 300, 400 years of analytical thinking and rationalism and scientism, useful and fantastic and fun as they've been, maybe we've lost sight a little bit of the other side of the equation, the mystical, magical, emotive experience of being alive. Maybe the answer to what is consciousness is not a logical premise. Maybe it's simply being alive.
Welcome to the temple. So you've progressed pretty far by now, and it's time to reveal something about the temple music. So the three massive temples in the game, they actually serve as a central hub for players to reach these small islands with puzzles. And I wanted these temples to evoke some sort of ancient divinity, some sense of awe and wonder. So I incorporated elements of sacral music into the tunes that are played here. You can probably hear the sound of church organs, choirs, chants, along with melodies, and it's all kind of rooted in this traditional European religious music. And it all contributes to the immersive atmosphere of these temples.
You stand before the gates of eternity.
So the next beat in the Milton plot is this bit where you apparently convince him that consciousness isn't real, and therefore you've passed the certification test to become an administrator. And there's this whole sequence where you apparently access the comms portal and talk to another person. But of course, that other person is just Milton messing with you. And I've never really been sure if I pulled this one off or not. I haven't read much about what people think of this particular turn. It's always very tricky as a writer when you're doing a rug pull, because you need to set up the rug pull and give clues, but they can't be so obvious that it's not a surprise when the rug's pulled. And I don't know if I got the balance right, because I've set up this Milton thing to I've trained player not to trust what they see on this terminal. So when you start talking to a person on the terminal, you've got pretty good reason not to trust it. And I'd love to know what proportion of players, maybe you can tell me on Twitter, what proportion believed they were talking to another person versus didn't. But the important thing is you get the chance to demonstrate whether you believe it or not, because when you next talk to Milton, you can use the supposedly secret password, which is faith, to try and shut him down and escape to the real world. Or you can express skepticism of that and not try and use it. So I don't know if that sequence worked, but it did serve an important purpose, which is to provide a crux point to this question of, do we have faith in what is delivered to us by our senses? And that's then a jumping off point for Milton to go full nihilist. And that then segues into the final endgame sequence, really. Milton starts asking, what is going to happen when you climb the tower? You're getting close to the tower. And something that actually surprised me and affected me, I'm watching back the Milton dialogues on YouTube. And he says, suppose you escape to the real world. Suppose you're in charge of the Ark. Who are you going to save? Who are you going to take with you? And of course, he argues with whatever you say. But the bit that caught me was at the end. Whatever you say, he's like, so does that include me? And I think it's the first time, and one of the only times in the game, where he shows a bit of vulnerability, and you've got something over him. And it's really the first core assessment of what is your relationship to Milton? What is your relationship to skepticism and logic? Is he a good guy to you, or a bad guy to you, or just another part of life? And I found that quite touching.
This is one of the earliest puzzles made, and it was created way back when the energy connectors worked a bit differently. The energy connector used to connect to every emitter and receiver inside when it was dropped. Thankfully, the later change to the connector mechanic did not make this puzzle obsolete, and with some minor modifications, it still ended up in the game.
To showcase our game to our players and to test in front of the live audience, we took part in several live gaming events like E3 and Gamescom. And for these events, we needed to create a special demo that would feature one level and a mix of several puzzles. So we started with introductory, with easy puzzles, tutorial puzzles, and then gradually introduced it more and more challenging ones. And we observed how the visitors at the Crow team would play the demo and carefully observed their reactions. And then we get home, we discussed what we saw some problems when people didn't understand something or identified actually some issues and fixed them in several iterations. So this iterative process helped us at the end to polish the demo and make it very, very smooth and enjoyable. And later, before the game launched, we released this demo on Steam as a free download, and we received really overwhelming enthusiastic feedback from the players that quite enjoyed the demo.
We actually got textures for these medieval walls from photos we took at Carcassonne in France. Back then, we had this problem. The textures were just flat images, and we couldn't get any good automated depth maps from them. AI just wasn't there yet. So we ended up hand-painting all of the depth maps ourselves. It was a lot of work, but it really paid off. Doubly so when we remastered the game in Unreal. We could finally turn those flat walls into proper 3D geometry.
The backbone of the entire story in a lot of ways is the story of the Garden of Eden, as told in the book of Genesis. It's a classic story, most people know it, but I think it's a shame when it gets dismissed, either by atheists or by Christians who oversimplify it and don't really think about what it means or what it could mean. So, there's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they have two trees there that they're told not to eat from, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And, of course, they do. The serpent tempts them, and they do, and then they gain this knowledge of themselves. And this is a very complicated and rich and very, very strange story. Because, first of all, you have to ask, why did God do this? Why did God create this situation? And it really kind of raises two questions. Did God know that this was going to happen or not? And then what are the moral consequences of him knowing that? If God didn't know that they were going to do this, and they truly have free will, then they could do things that he didn't anticipate, then of course that means that God doesn't know everything. He can't go beyond free will. He can't predict exactly what we're going to do. But if God is all-knowing and knew that this was going to happen, then does he not bear moral responsibility for what they were going to do? Because they were always going to do, right? If he knew that the situation that he had created inevitably led to the fall, then he knew that it was going to happen. Like, it doesn't matter that it was their choice. He still knew. He still set it up in such a way that it inevitably led to the fall, which of course raises the question, is the fall necessary? Is it necessary for Adam and Eve to do what they did? Is it necessary for the rest of the story, including the story of Jesus, to happen? And of course we can take this literally, and I think it is genuinely an interesting question if we just consider the story of Christianity itself. And then of course we can consider it in a more metaphorical or, visionary kind of way where we wonder what does this mean? Does God create all this suffering that is going to come from this, knowing that this is the only way, or that this is the right way for things to happen? Of course, that has parallels to Alexandra herself and what she does in the game. And if we examine the text of that particular moment, it's also completely fascinating, right? So it says, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." Okay, hold on. This is fascinating because, first of all, what do you mean when you say one of us? Some people say that God is talking about the angels, but I'm not sure that holds up, to be perfectly honest with you. And of course, a more sort of historicist view of the Bible would say, okay, this is a fragment of a time when Judaism was polytheistic, as is the fact that Elohim is a plural, which you'll also see referred to, kind of hinted at, when Elohim at one point in the game refers to the sigils of our name. He talks about himself in a plural. But first of all, what does that mean? And then first, why is it even possible for humans to become like gods? It's fascinating that this is presented as a possibility for human beings, that they could become this way. And what does that mean? Note also that the imagery of the Tree of Life appears in a variety of ways in the game. It appears in the Apocrypha of St. Edward, and then in Road to Gehenna, in the text adventure Jerusalem, and then finally, I think very prominently in Talos too. And it was kind of always meant to be there as this thread and as foreshadowing for what comes later. Uriel, of course, is the angel that in some traditions guards Eden with his fiery sword. I don't know if in Elohim's mind the fiery sword relates to the lasers or not. It always depends on how he is interpreting all of these things. The line in the Apocrypha of St. Edward, which are a fictional part of our story here, is, "Behold, the tree grows still, though the city is dead. Within all that is mortal there is the seed of immortality, for it is an immortal that fashioned it from chaos and void." This, apart from its kind of more obvious meaning of the possibility of resurrection at the end of the game, also is kind of a small reference to Paradise Lost, in which the line goes, "The heavens and earth rose out of chaos," which is a little interesting tweak on Milton's part, because of course it's not the orthodox view that all of this rose out of chaos, but out of nothingness, that it was created out of nothingness. But that is actually a small way in which Milton himself tied Christianity to classical philosophy, and we're kind of echoing that here. Although of course to Elohim, chaos, as you can see from a couple of other lines that he says, chaos represents the last days of human civilization when things kind of fell apart.
You know how most of our puzzles keep players boxed in with walls? Well, this map was our first shot at doing something different. Instead of walls, we put in these cliff edges. Gives players something nice to look at while they're solving puzzles. This is where we started going crazy with Easter eggs. Like, really crazy. We were making these super complex gameplay sequences. Actually, they got so involved that it was almost like making a whole second game. We had to dial it back a bit in later maps, or we'd never have finished the game.
So names are important to me because I frequently can't write without having the name of the story or the character. And Alexandra Drennan was just the scientist for the longest time, and that kept her generic. It kept her from being a specific person, and she needed to be a specific person. So I struggled for a long time to find a name, and eventually came up with Alexandra Drennan. Now that has two component parts. Alexandra obviously connects to Alexander and Alexander the Great and the Great Library of Alexandria, which are two things that I frequently think about. The Great Library, of course, connects to Carl Sagan and to Cosmos, where he talks very eloquently about what it meant, both in a positive way and in its limitations, the limitations of how knowledge was applied. And it also connects to the archive that Chernyshevsky is building. As for Drennan, this came from the writer Catherine M. Drennan, who was a writer on the TV show Babylon 5 that I love very dearly. She wrote a fantastic episode of season 1 and also one of the novels, and I guess her name just kind of got stuck in my head. And as I was playing with names, suddenly I thought, Alexandra Drennan. Catherine M. Drennan also had worked on Cosmos in some capacity. I'm not sure exactly in which capacity, but she worked with Carl Sagan apparently, so it all kind of fits together. And the thing is, when I came up with that name, it was one of those moments when something just clicks, when you almost feel like you've discovered it rather than created it. You don't get those very often as a writer, but when you do, it's amazing. I had that with a couple of titles of things that I've written, like The Sea Will Claim Everything and Gospels of the Flood and the Talos Principle. And Alexandra Drennan was a big one, because when I realized it, it just instantly felt right, and I suddenly kind of had the character as if she'd been there all along, and there was a wonderful moment.
So now we're on to the Milton Endgame, and just watching the Let's Plays on YouTube, I'm like, it boggles my mind how complex I made it, how many branches there are. I'm not going to be able to get my head back around it right now. But my recollection is that there's really three main branches. The first is you can try heartily to hold your ground and argue that everything you've argued and believe is true, and ultimately decide to leave him behind. And leaving him behind is surely the logical conclusion for anyone who really thinks that there's no flaw in their beliefs, that they have everything absolutely right. And I suspect that, I don't remember, that even if you try to take him with you, if you haven't given any ground and you said everything I believe is right, I think he refuses, but someone will correct me on that. At the other extreme, there's the branch where you say, you become a nihilist, basically. You say, I see there's nothing can really be known for sure, and you were right about things. And then there's the middle branch, which I think is called Press the Serpent. And that's the branch where you don't take either extreme, and instead you hold on to some sense of faith and belief. You argue for some things that are important, but you also accept that not everything is straightforward. Not everything you believe or came into the game believing is necessarily true, that you can make mistakes and you still have something to learn. And this is a theme for me. I like and think that the middle branch is, I hate to say it is the good ending to me. I grew up hating the way that the classic CRPGs rewarded you for being extreme. It was fun if you were really good, and it was fun if you were really evil. But I always identified with chaotic neutral. These days, I would say I'm probably chaotic good, or at least lawful neutral. And it always bothered me that wasn't supported the same way. And with Milton, I hope it's fairly clear, simply having absolute faith in anything that you're told by an authority is not the smart plan. And having no belief at all is also not the smart plan. I mean, it's not even about having a smart plan. It's just actually practically unintelligible. One of the philosophical quotes I always wind up coming to a few hours into a party is Camus, when he says, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." To me, if you're a true nihilist like Milton, if you really truly don't believe in anything, then you have no reason to go on living. And all of us here today have chosen, whether we realize it or not, to go on living. So we all do believe in something, even if it's just the desirability of experiencing joy, or saving our loved ones from experiencing our death. And that does, in fact, seem to indicate that Milton is not a true, perfect nihilist, because Milton does want you to take him with you. And at the other extreme, it's the horseshoe. If you simply believe absolutely everything with no sense of skepticism or analysis, that's the same as nihilism, because if you believe everything, you're going to live in contradiction. And how will you ever work out a reason to go on living if that reason is provided by outside authorities? And so I've heard people describe Milton as the hero of this story. And I've heard people describe him as the bad guy. And I understand where those people are coming from. And I think it's a function of where people are coming from in life when they play this game. I think if what you've experienced so far in life when you play is like some form of intellectual fascism, is too many people telling you what you should think and not enough freedom to think for yourself, then Milton will be your hero. And maybe if you've been surrounded by people who aren't driven by faith in something, then maybe he's the bad guy. And at the end of this sequence, you choose whether to take him with you or not. And that is a test of where you are on this spectrum. Is he everything? Is he nothing? Or is he one side of the coin? To me, I'm an anarchist about everything. I think the world is most beautiful when people make their own choices and recognize no authority but themselves. But also that we recognize that we're not separate from everything else in this world. That what it is for me to live well and for you to live well is not in competition. I can't construct a watertight deductive argument for why love is better than hate. I can't prove that. But anyone that has loved knows it's true, instinctively, intuitively. And these deductive dilemmas distract us from that. I'll do a tangent, which is going to make this commentary even longer than it already is, but it's a useful one. I do believe in the devil in the same way that I believe in Plato's Fall. I believe that hate is real and that we can know that for sure. And I believe that love is real and that we can know that for sure. And that one is much more lovely than the other, and we know that for sure. And the force of hate in the world is the devil. And the devil manifests in myriad forms, including in each of us. And what the devil likes to do is give us these supposedly black and white dilemmas. He likes to make us choose between Trump and Biden, between giving rights to animals or eating them. And what I want to suggest is that it's way less important which horn of the dilemma you grasp than what you do once you have. That what makes the world more wonderful for all of us isn't what we decide in a given case, because that's out of our hands. We can't control it. What matters is what we do with it. So I used to be very simplistically left-wing. I would vote for any candidate that was left. in their policies. Where now I would say less important than the policies is how and why they're done. And I would merrily vote for conservative policies if I thought the person doing them was genuinely moved from a place of love and care. We spent too much time fighting over what basically amounts to syntax, when what I think we should be valuing is love.
People sometimes find it confusing when I speak about things like visionary truth, or, for that matter, love, or the sublime, when at the same time I say I am a materialist, or I come from a tradition of the Enlightenment, or I take a scientific view of the universe. But a scientific view of the universe is simply one that observes what is there, and it's not a cynical, nihilistic view of the universe. We can see with our own eyes that consciousness exists and art exists, and we can have these sublime experiences that are simply real, just like love is one of the very few true sources of meaning, as, philosophers have discovered over and over, and ordinary people have discovered over and over, maybe more so than philosophers. So no matter how you view the world, I think you need to face the world that is there, and that is a world that includes immense beauty and powerful experiences. And just because these things are expressed through chemicals, through matter, or at least as far as we can tell so far they seem to be, if it turns out that that's not the case, then we obviously need to change our views accordingly. But just because these things are expressed through matter doesn't mean that they're not meaningful. Everything that we see is expressed through matter. Your family is made of matter, art is made of matter, your brain is made of matter, but what it does is what matters, and what life is like is frequently sublime.
A quick addendum to my previous comment, so I can hang some meat on the bones of the argument and put my money where my mouth is. And it's a bit our frogs people, so maybe it's fun. I suggested that in the kind of logical dilemmas that Milton's presenting and ultimately undermining, I suggested that trying to deduce the correct moral or existential thing in any given dilemma is basically impossible and unhelpful for the reasons that Milton lays out. And what's more important is that whatever we do it from love. I gave the example of eating animals versus giving them rights. Now, for me personally, I don't think it's right for me to eat animals. But I do because I'm weak. But if you gave me this classic modern devilish black and white dilemma tomorrow of shall we start arresting people who eat animals versus shall we have the status quo, it would be a very hard decision for me that I'm not sure has necessarily a totally right answer. I would probably, because I'm quite liberal, I'd probably lean towards, out of those two extremes, let's keep the status quo. So that's an impossible dilemma for me to deductively solve. But what makes it easy for me is saying, I'm not so worried which way we go. I'm more worried that we do it with love and understanding and consideration. If we're going to keep eating animals, then I think we should be, maybe gradually but firmly, moving towards a world where those animals have the best possible lives that we can give them. I think that's a no-brainer. And if that means that meat becomes unaffordable for the least wealthy in our societies, then I think there should be provision to ensure that they can still get and enjoy meat. So socialism, basically. And if we're going to outlaw eating animals, then I don't think we should start tomorrow by throwing people in jail who eat animals. I think, again, it has to be a gradual, considered, understanding thing where we recognize that a hell of a lot of people in this world have entire cultures and traditions and value systems built around eating animals. That there are still uncontacted tribes who would not survive without eating animals. I think it'd be ridiculous to be absolute about such a thing. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the way the devil works in our society is to give us this impossible choice between these two black and white extremes of punish people that eat animals versus do whatever you like to animals and it doesn't matter. That's an impossible choice, and Milton shows us that there's no logically correct answer. But when you give me the choice of the kind, loving, understanding implementation of either, it's an easy choice. They're both wonderful. So if you take one thing from me ever, please make it this. Please let's put less energy into fighting one another over what's right and more energy into cooperating with one another to do whatever we do with love and understanding.
Be respectful, for their service is born from the love that transcends death. And their love is for you also.
I've always been a fan of the Infinite Monkey Cage podcast, and it's been for a long time. It's a BBC podcast. The way how this show actually blends the complex scientific ideas and questions with humor is incredibly engaging, and I think it's very effective. I also feel that it kind of inspired me to incorporate more playful and thought-provoking elements into our games. So as a tribute, I proposed implementation of this secret Rebus reference to the show, and I hope that you, our fellow players, will discover what it means and maybe even feel the urge to listen to one or two episodes of my favorite podcast.
This puzzle is more an Easter egg than a puzzle. After solving it, you can enter a vertical fan stream and see that you have spelled out the prototype name of the Talos principle with laser beams. This is the original puzzle from which the bichromatic entanglement puzzle was born. It was shown to be too hard, and it was decided we needed a tutorial puzzle for the energy connector redundancy on its own.
In the spirit of the original great core team tradition, we have crafted this developer island and populated it with famous big head characters representing the core team developers, but this time they are having monitors with faces instead of heads. What we have here, what you can see here, is a diverse group of developers who contributed to both the original game and the game that you are currently playing, the Talos Principle Reawakened. As you explore the island, you will be able to see the developers performing some activities that hint at their specific roles within the team. All this experience should offer a glimpse into the creative processes that actually happen behind the scenes.
And bring glory to your kind. But remember, you must not ascend the great tower, for it shall bring death and the end of your generations.
The Talos Principle required really extensive testing, and we want every puzzle to be solvable throughout the game development. We had almost around 100 puzzles, and to playtest through all of this for humans was really, really tiresome and annoying, and it would take almost 10 hours to go through that. So we tried to automate this process, and we created a playtesting bot, that character that would automatically play through all of the puzzles in fast-forward mode. It was a game changer when we did that. We almost didn't test the core game functionality ever from that moment. It actually automated annoying repetitive tasks and drastically cut down the testing time. For example, while a human tester would probably need almost 10 hours for a full playthrough, bot in Fast Forward could finish the game in just like under 20 minutes, and it would never get bored or tired, while human would go crazy in that time. By running through the game quickly, it would also immediately report any blocking issues. The bot helped human testers to focus on more important and complex tasks. And at the end, we achieved very impressive turnaround times. Like within 1 hour after a code or content change being submitted, we had a bot run through the game and reporting if there are like critical issues or not. And in total, the bot log would equal to about 8 years of full-day human testing. So all of this highlights how efficient and essential the bot was to development of the Talos principle. The tower in Nexus symbolizes the forbidden tree from the Garden of Eden. It is incredibly high, and it's kind of mysterious, and its presence actually creates a feeling of temptation and the forbidden knowledge. So the act of climbing the Nexus, when Elohim told you not to do that, it actually made us eating the forbidden fruit, a bold act that brings enlightenment but also consequences. This symbolism encourages players to question authority, maybe to challenge actually the rules, and decide whether to seek the knowledge or not, even if it comes with the risks. This is actually the pure heart of the game. This dilemma is the heart of the Talos principle.
And say, with absolute conviction, that it was good to be human.
Alexandra's journey, as we see it in this game, is probably my favorite part of the game, and to me, the heart of the game in a lot of ways. She expresses a kind of universalist humanism that I find very lacking in the world today. I'm desperate for more of it, thus I wrote some of it for this game. She loves humanity and civilization. She sees the good in us, which is so evident if you just look at how remarkable the things are that we have achieved, how incredible, like even just you playing this digital work of art and listening to me talking. This is incredible that it even exists, and we have done so many incredible things, and we are capable of so much more if we start understanding ourselves in a different way. That can't be the entirety of her story, right? It can't be just here's a bunch of ideas of finding meaning in ourselves, in our existence, not rejecting God or rejecting other types of belief, but finding meaning in what we can observe and what's here, and loving this and defending this and the inherent value of this world that we are in. Even if there is nothing else, saying this is beautiful and good and worth fighting for. But of course, we're human beings and nothing is ever that easy. So Alexandra's journey is about the difficulty of sticking to that idea. You see her at times start to question herself, start to falter. So in a way, it's about faith and her faith in these ideas and what her faith compels her to do, which is to keep working at this project to save humanity and to make this enormous sacrifice that other people are also making, of course, of not spending time with loved ones and not doing the human things that she would like to do, and instead just staying there at the dam working to the end and until her death. And because such is human life, she does not get to see her victory. She does not get to see that it all works out. She dies thinking, maybe it's all broken. Maybe this is not going to work. And there's an element of grace here in that some of her mistakes end up making it all work. Some of the things that she never managed to fix end up contributing to this mix that ultimately creates the player character who then becomes Athena and takes her voice and in a way symbolically resurrects her. And I think those human moments at the end when she's struggling and her triumph in a way, which is to maintain her faith, that she doesn't lose her faith, that she struggles with it, but she comes through and she sticks with what she believes, is a very important part of this story, and to me a very deeply moving one. And then of course Talos too moves towards saying, okay, these ideas are beautiful. Now let's try to put them into action. Now let's see what happens when flawed and sometimes annoying human beings actually try to live by these ideas, because it's never as easy as that.
In all our games, we try to put a lot of effort into creating, crafting meaningful and exciting endings. So being like a boss fight in Serious M or something like that. So we wanted for the Talos principle to create something that was like really, really exciting, very special, unique, something gorgeous, right? Because, we really appreciate people getting to the end of the game, and we would really like to reward them and left them with feeling that they achieved something special was there at the end of the game waiting for them. And I was thinking about it, what to do, and I was thinking I want something really, really unique and special. So kind of I was aiming at a new mechanic that would elevate the existing gameplay to a new level. So I came up with this idea of a master tetromino puzzle. The vision was to take the familiar 2D arranger puzzles like the Tetromino arranger locks and push it a level up, give it another dimension and make it in 3D. So I felt that it would be really, really cool, and I was so proud. And I didn't know how to test it out, so I decided to make a physical puzzle out of that. I went out and bought some pieces of wooden planks, and I cut them in small chunks. Then I glued them together, and after a few days of doing all of that, I was ready to test this out. I brought pieces, wooden tetrominos to the office. I was very, very anxious to see how fun it will be, and when I tried it was it was unbelievably awful, boring, frustrating, and everything that you don't want in a game. So we scrapped it out in a matter of minutes, and we knew that it wasn't going to work. So we decided to develop a way better and more rewarding and fun ending for the game.
For the final challenge, we aimed to create something distinct from the rest of the game. We didn't want to ramp up the difficulty excessively or design an overly long and hard puzzle, as this could deter some players from completing the game. Instead, we maintained a standard difficulty level, but introduced elements of time pressure and cooperation. Unlike rest of the game, where player had no time constraints, final challenge features deadly storm rising from below, pushing the player forward and upward, creating sense of urgency and pressure. Naturally, we anticipated that players might die several times, but learning and remembering their previous steps would allow them to progress further with each attempt. Interestingly, final puzzle can be completed solo, without help of the messenger helper, and this is by design. Many of the solo steps were initially unintentional, and there were few places where you could not progress alone. But when we saw most of the path was already there, instead of patching it, we decided to build a whole path for those who want to do it solo, but still, it is not so obvious. In general, during the testing phase, we detected many exploits throughout the game. We established a rule to leave non-obvious exploits because it's fun to break the puzzle. We even made it part of the metagame, where you need to break some puzzles and take elements out of them, for example, to be able to access certain Easter eggs. Breaking the puzzles gave completely new dimension to gameplay, and many enjoy countless hours of exploring the possibilities.
So Croteam was actually one of the first gaming companies ever to introduce something called dynamic music. I remember Serious Sam games when we started working on them. They had 3 different types of music, and those music would be switching depending on the intensity of the action, which you could see on screen. And I wanted to explore this process even further in Talos Principle, so I decided to try something new for the last puzzle, for basically the boss fight. Contrary to the most puzzles in the game, the last puzzle actually puts a certain time pressure on the player. So you have to go faster than usual because there is a rising storm which threatens to kill you. And this is the only puzzle where we actually didn't want the player to feel relaxed. We wanted the player to feel the need to hurry up before time ran out. So I constructed this last music in 5 layers. It starts with a basic layer, and then each new layer that is added, there are more instruments, and it builds up in intensity. So layers are added depending on how much time is left, resulting in powerful music conveying urgency when you are really close to the dying.
You got to the tower. Congratulations. I swear I completed like 2/3 of the puzzles in this game for real when we were playtesting and writing. And the tower, I just cheated the whole way through. So really well done. So some random notes that I want to finish on. First of all, oh my god, I rewatched the ending, and all credit to Crow Team and all the fantastic people there. Like, it's hard when you're in it, but with a little bit of 10 years of distance, I do think I felt a little bit of why so many of you wonderful people think this thing is special. I do feel that it's special. I think that, as you saw in those emails I read out right at the start, Alan and Davor wanted to do something really, really cool. Cool is not a good enough word. They felt a sense of pattern and purpose in the universe and allowed it to express itself through them and through us, through this game. And that ending cutscene is just so perfect. And the music, the art, the pacing, really, well done, guys. This is for you. Davor, Alan, Damien, Thomas, Moss, the whole Crow Team, and Jonas and Verena. You guys did fantastic. Well done. And I did fantastic too, and we're all so lucky to have each other. And on a less whimsical note, on a practical level, this game is an example of how art should be, how games should be. It did start with a technical thing. It started with, we got a bunch of puzzles for Serious Sam that could be their own game. But everyone tapped into the same coherent vision. And everyone was trusted to do what they do best. And it's one of the finest things, if not the finest thing, I've ever been a part of. So, thank you everyone. Thank you devs. Thank you players. And see you in Gehenna.